Good day. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of our thoughts and experiences in trying to capture data with regards to wildlife poisoning on the African Wildlife Poisoning Database. I'm Botha from the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and together with my co-authors, Drs. Darcy Ogada and Lizanne Roxburgh, we will share with you some of the insights that we've gathered over the period since 2012 when this database was initiated. That started at the Pan-African Vultures Summit in Kenya, where it was realized that we need to gather and collate as much information on this topic as possible, in particular with regards to vulture conservation, where we realized very little was known about the impact of poisoning overall on vultures across the African continent. This was later adapted and adopted within the Convention of Migratory Species Vulture Multi-Species Action Plan, and our initial focus was primarily on sub-Saharan Africa, but that's also now expanded to include all of North Africa as well. The aim of the database is to contribute towards assessing the impact of wildlife poisoning on all wildlife, and therefore now the focus is expanded beyond vultures as well. The database is, the aim of the database is to be open access in terms of the submission of data, but there is some limits in terms of the access of data for obvious reasons. It's fairly sensitive information very often, but people still can have access to data summaries and then can approach the database for specific information around perhaps certain incidents, but also overall countries, data sets, etc. People that want to submit information or want to find out more can either go to the internet interface or the website, which is provided here on screen. And we've also developed a mobile app which can be downloaded, which is forms part of the Survey 123 software through ArcGIS. And people can, through that, by downloading that either on a laptop or a mobile phone, can submit data through this medium to the database directly in the field, or when they return from the field and are able to then collate data and submit in that manner. So we try to make submission of data as accessible as possible to people out there across the continent. In terms of the data that's been captured to date, we've also made an effort to try and get as much information, historical information on the database, and the oldest information that we have goes back as far as 1961. So we have all available records from known incidents that we've been able to gather and collate so far. The focus is on all wildlife, not vultures alone. And of course, as with many of these types of data sets, there are gaps within it. In particular here, in terms of species, the lower taxa are very often, are poorly represented. We have currently 588 records of poisoning or poisoning incidents that have been captured on the database. That represents almost 23,000 wildlife mortalities of 49 species of wildlife, and also includes 4 domestic animal species. Important to notice from a vulture perspective is that 88% of all mortalities are represented by vultures that have been killed by vulture poisoning, and the individual species that has been most affected currently on the database is the critically endangered African white-backed vulture, for which we have just under 6,000 mortalities in total. Mortalities per species, just to expand on that again, when you look at this graph, you will see that there's a wide range of species, a significant impact on birds in particular, but then also species like the African elephant and the lion start featuring fairly prominently further down on the list of species. But when you look at the top 7 or 8 species that are most adversely affected by wildlife poisoning, you will note that vultures feature 5 out of the 8 species in that top 8 are vultures that are affected and that have been impacted by poisoning, and therefore reflects what we already know, is that vultures by far are the group of animals that are most severely affected by wildlife poisoning. And when I talk about the group of animals, of course, we're referring here more to larger animals and not necessarily considering insects, etc. Some of the lower taxa for which data at the moment is very poorly represented and not captured extensively. When you look at the poisoning incidents per country, quite interesting here. South Africa and Kenya certainly stand out as countries that have contributed most to the database, and that's probably largely a function of the fact that two of the collators of the database are based in South Africa. The Endangered Wildlife Trust, which we work for, has been involved in capturing wildlife poisoning data for over 30 years now. And then the other is Kenya, where Darcy Ogada and her colleagues have been working very hard within communities and captured extensive data sets from incidents that have occurred there. And then we also have the other countries that are represented there in Southern Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and Zambia, and Zimbabwe, Mozambique, where the EWT has been active. And of course, what this represents is that there are huge gaps in terms of our knowledge. Many incidents that happen in other countries that are either not noted, that are not captured, and are not reported, and which we don't have access to the data to. The figures that you see here is more a reflection of the effort of data collection and gathering information on these incidents than the actual mortalities that are happening out there. We know that these mortalities are vastly underrecorded, and in some countries just never recorded and never makes it onto the database. And part of our focus is to try and change this. It is an ongoing challenge to, even within the countries that we work, to ensure that we can capture data and that we capture it adequately so that you can reasonably and sensibly do a proper analysis of this. The mortalities per country, again, sort of reflects that to a certain extent. You know, again, the effort that the Peregrine Fund, the Conservation Corporation, etc. in Kenya have undertaken over the last 4 or 5 years to gather as much information as possible about the poisoning of a wide range of wildlife in various places in the country has led to the significant number of mortalities that you see there, showing that Kenya is very well represented, and it is a reflection of the excellent effort that has gone into gathering this information there. To a certain extent, likewise with Zambia, and of course with South Africa over a long period of time, we have done our best to gather as much information as possible. And also, for most of the countries there with higher figures is the networks that do exist. We are able to gather substantial information. I think the one difference there, or the one country that also is a recent arrival within that top number is Guinea-Bissau, where there was a major incident earlier this year, which I will talk about shortly. Fewer incidents in countries doesn't necessarily mean that there are fewer mortalities that are taking place. An example of this is the single incident in Botswana, where more than 536 vultures and other birds of prey were killed in a single incident. And it just gives you an idea, when you start analyzing this data and you go in depth, how much information you can glean from the data that is there. It sort of reflects the impact of what single incidents can have. Another example, of course, is this Guinea-Bissau incident, where now we estimate more than 2,000 birds were killed in a single incident that happened at multiple locations within this tiny country in West Africa. Substance used within these incidents also, what you do note there is that the carbamates, the organophosphates, the rodenticides, those sorts of substances that we know are fairly commonly used in these wildlife poisoning incidents are represented there, with the carbamates probably at the moment the most frequently used, and then the unknowns. And what the unknowns basically say to us is that very often sampling within the African context is inadequate. Samples are often poorly preserved. When people do discover incidents, they are fairly advanced, so you do note advanced decomposition that has taken place, so you can't collect samples. There are issues with transportation permits, moving samples across international boundaries. Very often laboratory facilities are totally lacking in certain countries. There are issues with customs and regulations and so on, and that's why this information is sometimes quite difficult to come by, and we never, in many cases, find out what the reasons for the poisoning was. But when you look at the drivers based on this database, human-wildlife conflict by far stands out as one of the main drivers of wildlife poisoning on the continent. Then you also have issues like poaching, belief use, the consumption, people killing animals for consumption, using poison, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to expand on the range of reasons why people poison wildlife, but also in particular vultures, as you can see from the range of methods and drivers on the slide. We also have used this information to conduct a threat analysis using the database, using the information on it, and then identifying areas, also using other data sets such as elephant poisoning, looking at where in Africa these poisoning incidents are most likely to take place. And we are then able to focus our conservation actions primarily on these areas. And if you consider that and you look at the areas where the Endangered Wildlife Trust have conducted training since 2017, these areas on the map corresponds largely with where we've done the sensitivity mapping. And since 2017, we've been able to train more than 2,500 people in 10 countries in East and Southern Africa, with the aim of expanding that to Central and West Africa over time as well. And the same applies with the Peregrine Fund that have conducted training in Kenya to more than 2,000 people since they initiated training in 2017. And they are doing excellent work within that country to start addressing the threat of wildlife poisoning, which of course is an ongoing process. So what else is being done? We are looking at promoting both preventative and responsive measures within known poisoning hotspots, looking at review and improvement of legislation in those countries that are affected, looking at the banning of certain substances where it is appropriate, providing guidance to law enforcement, supporting and promoting proper investigation and prosecution procedures, making people aware of the health risks associated with wildlife poisoning, to facilitate also better capacity and ability to conduct sample collection and analysis within countries, to reinitiate stockpiles programs where people can get rid of toxins. And then also now a recent development is developing capacity within Africa for the use of poison sniffer dogs to firstly identify sources of poisoning, remove these, or to also use these animals on scene investigations. In conclusion, I think it's important that wildlife poisoning is recognized as a very significant threat to a wide range of wildlife, and it's important for us to work together across international boundaries in Africa to prevent and reduce the impact of this action on all wildlife. And there are a range of actions that need to be done, which unfortunately I don't have enough time to expand on here, but which is essential to enable us to make inroads in terms of this. And a key component of that is to ensure and to work towards getting broad-based political and governmental support, and for us to work together across international boundaries to address this very important issue. And then also to look across a wider global scope and to try and promote the implementation of a global wildlife poisoning database, probably an action that can be collated by the IUCN Wildlife Poisoning Task Force, which has recently been established. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you. I know I'm a little bit over time, but I trust that this very brief look into the database does provide you with insights, and hopefully if you have any further questions or would like to work with us on this, we would like to hear from you. Thank you very much.